Jim Jordan, in my mind, is the sort of person, imagine you're doing a long-distance flight, I don't know, between, let's say, New York and Australia. Jim Jordan sits himself next to you. You're thinking, if there was a possibility, would you change seats? Smug, full of himself, and the type of person that you can imagine a few years ago doesn't see very important things that happen right in front of his own eyes. Weird, that. But weirdly, even weirder so, this isn't a man who has an opinion about so many different things and isn't as clever as he thinks he is. So, Adam Schiff, good on Adam Schiff, who literally, let's rewind back to when Adam Schiff just literally tore him a brand new hey-ho.
Thank you, Chairman. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have us believe that this bill will bring back power to Congress. But in fact, what it really does is give more power to the judiciary and a Supreme Court that has become a partisan institution with a reactionary social agenda, one that has disregarded decades of precedent and denied millions of Americans the right to reproductive freedom, one that has also taken aim at clear water and clear air protections. And one thing that should be absolutely certain, and that is until the Supreme Court adopts an enforceable code of ethics, they should not be entrusted with even more power. My amendment today is very simple. It would allow Mr. Fitzgerald's bill to apply to courts if and when, and only when, all federal courts have adopted an enforceable code of ethics. A code of ethics for the Supreme Court is badly needed, as we've seen with serious allegations of undisclosed gifts and undisclosed travel and undisclosed lodging and undisclosed payments and benefits or compensation received by justices or their families from individuals and law firms with business before the Supreme Court. A code of ethics is absolutely essential. This amendment, which would require that before these kind of changes go into effect, that all federal courts have a code of ethics, is a small step to dealing with a very large problem at the Supreme Court. In fact, I think term limits on the Supreme Court, in which justices, after an appropriate time, would be required to relocate to the Court of Appeals or the District Court, are also an important reform, and I think the court needs to be expanded, given that the court was packed by Mitch McConnell, depriving a Democratic president of an appointment because he said the election was too close, and then in the most jarringly hypocritical fashion, jamming down another appointment during a Republican presidency when people were literally voting for Joe Biden for president. But nevertheless, although those larger steps I think are very necessary, we can begin the process of restoring some confidence in the court by at least insisting on an enforceable code of ethics. No more power for the court until there is accountability. And with that, I would...
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Thank you. I'd simply like to point out that the gentleman makes a very good point about the size of the Supreme Court, but there's another reason also. Historically, the Supreme Court, there's been one Supreme Court justice for every circuit. There are currently 13 circuits, so we're behind the times, and we ought to have 4 more Supreme Court justices for that reason, in addition to the reasons the gentleman expressed.
Reclaiming my time, I think the gentleman, I think, is absolutely right, and you can add to that the extraordinary increase in the caseload that goes before the court if we were just looking at efficiency. But of course, there's so much more at stake with the packing of the current Supreme Court. But in any event, this amendment is about some accountability, some enforcement, some presence even of a code of ethics. If we see nothing else, we've seen, I think, with the current court, the proof that power unrestrained by even a code of ethics can lead to the worst kind of results. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
All the federal courts with right-wing judges. So it's interesting to hear that from them. As to impeachment of judges, I think probably Justice Thomas should probably be impeached. I don't know about anybody else. I mean, obviously, he's not going to be impeached by this House, but given what we've seen about his financial transactions, he probably should be impeached, just as Judge Porteous was impeached in 1989. Now, yes, the Supreme Court number has varied from time to time. It has historically been the same as the number of circuits. It ought to be 13 now, but it ought to be 13 also because the court has been packed. The court has been very deliberately packed. We saw this with Mitch McConnell stopping Merrick Garland from even getting a hearing 11 months before a presidential election because the new president ought to be able to have his selection, and then ramming Amy Coney Barrett through after the election before Joe Biden took office to deprive him. This was rank hypocrisy and packing the court. So this has to be undone, and we should not hear lectures about packing the court. And with that, I'll yield to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I never got an answer to my question from my colleague on the other side of the aisle about whether she considers accepting luxury travel to be consistent with good behavior, particularly when you're accepting luxury travel with someone who has a deep interest in the business of the court. I never got a chance to ask my colleague across the aisle whether she considers to be acting in good behavior if you're accepting luxury accommodations or if you're selling property to lawyers who have business before the court without disclosing it. What about selling property if that property isn't worth what it's being purchased for? I don't know if that's the case, but I think it should be investigated. I'd be happy to yield.
Is it good behavior for the Majority Leader of the Senate to stand on the steps of the Supreme Court and threaten two sitting justices?
Well, there are remedies which are called...
The yes or no. You posed a number of yes or no questions to us just a little bit later. It's a yes or no question.
Reclaiming my time in the Senate and in the House, we have a code of ethics. But apparently the Republicans don't believe there should be a code of ethics for the Supreme Court. And why? Because the Supreme Court is doing the bidding of the Republicans. It used to be a conservative court, but it's not a conservative court anymore. A conservative court would have some respect for precedent. This court has no respect for precedent. It is a partisan reactionary court, but it's doing your partisan reactionary work, so you don't care who they're selling their property to. You don't care if they have business before the court. You don't care who they're staying with, whose yacht they're on. You don't care about any of that. You don't want a code of ethics for justices who are doing your political dirty work. Well, I do. I don't think it should be a choice between either you impeach them or they can sit on the court and be as corrupt as they want. It's a binary choice. You accept whatever corruption as long as you get the court decisions you want or impeachment. No, they ought to have a code of ethics. Like any other federal officer, there should be some code of ethics. It shouldn't be too much to ask. I mean, do you really think it's right for justices to be doing luxury travel with people with interest before the court and not reporting it? Do you really think that's good behavior?
Will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield for an answer to that question. Do you think that's good behavior?
No, and I think that that's a question perhaps that ought to be asked of Justice Sotomayor and former Justice Breyer, because the evidence against them is in terms of taking money and travel and things like that from people who had, or entities that had cases before the Supreme Court.
My time, I'm glad to hear you acknowledge. I'm glad to hear you acknowledge that Clarence Thomas was engaged in bad behavior, and so there ought to be some repercussion, don't you think? Shouldn't there be some remedy short of impeachment for judges who engage in bad conduct, for judges who engage in conduct which calls into legitimate question their decisions? I certainly do. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I know the hour is late, and I'm not going to take an unlimited amount of time, but I would like to opine on one thing. As the chairman of the court subcommittee,
I want to point out two things. Number one, we're getting a little far afield because we're debating an amendment to apply a code of ethics to the Supreme Court, a code of ethics like the code of ethics that applies to all other federal courts. Second point I want to make is really, I think in some answer to Ms. Hageman, I introduced a bill, as was pointed out a few years ago, to increase the number of Supreme Court justices by 4. Hank Johnson introduced a bill for term limits on Supreme Court justices, and you can do that in spite of the fact that the Constitution says they should hold office during good behavior. It doesn't say which judicial office. So you could take a Supreme Court judge and say you're a circuit court judge. And if you combine the two bills, you'd end up with a system where every president would get 2 appointments during his term, and it wouldn't be the Russian roulette of who dies when. And I'll yield back.
Okay, reclaiming my time, you know, I agree with the...
Founding Republican on that side of the aisle, and I hope that's not too damning of your reputation. I will say this. I would have never supported expanding the court but for what took place when Mitch McConnell withheld an appointment from one president and rushed an appointment for another. That's what changed since you and I got here. When you and I got here, that kind of stratagem, which elevated party and trying to obtain power over the institutional interests, would have never taken place, but it does now, and it has brought disrepute to the court.
I'm going to have to yield back my time.
Time of the
I
gentleman.
thank the gentleman. Yield back.
Has expired. The gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
I will.
The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I thank the chairman. And I thought just a moment ago, what an
Recollection, but your recollection of what Roosevelt tried to do to expand the court is correct, and they did call it court packing. He was unsuccessful. Mitch McConnell tried a different kind of court packing, and he was successful.
Well, but it's not
because his argument.
Let me ask you the question. I'll ask you this question. I'll take my time back and ask you because again, you said he packed the court, but do you deny that throughout all American history, until you, that court packing meant something other than the way you run the Senate to either confirm or not confirm justices and by their processes under their rules? That's not packing, is it?
What was?
I'll yield for that for an answer to that question.
It is absolutely packing when you, in an unprecedented manner, withhold an appointment of one justice, making the argument it was too close to the election, 9 months before the election, and then mere weeks before the election, you jam an appointment down so that you have a Democratic appointment thwarted, a Republican appointment jammed in complete contradiction to the earlier argument. That is packing the court, and the result of those two justices means an entire generation of Americans will live under a reactionary court, but for the fact that he did it.
Would the gentleman from North Carolina yield to me?
No, I'm going to respond to that. And you can use, you can use any word that you want to and change the definition, but that was about how procedural rules were applied in the Senate. You can disagree with them, but that's how the majority, I watched, you guys used, under Nancy Pelosi, you used same-day authority forever. You dispensed with the requirement of quorum. You let people stay home in the entire Congress and yet record votes. I don't think any of that made sense, but the way you resolve that is not go fundamentally change the institution of the Congress. It's defeat you in an election and take over and run it the way it should be run. That's not packing. It's not the same thing as fundamentally upending an institution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, I seek recognition to strike the last word.
Okay, thank you. Gentlelady is recognized. I assume you're yielding to someone. I understand. I feel for you. I hope that voice clears up. I think you're yielding to Mr. Nadler?
I do yield my time to Ranking Member Nadler.
Okay.
I thank the gentlelady, and I hope her voice heals up too. I'm not, we've had a very interesting debate and excursion into court packing and all of this stuff. I just want to remind people that what we're dealing with is an amendment that really doesn't say much about court packing. All this amendment says is that the
sponsor brought it up, Mr. Chairman.
I'm not blaming anybody.
Okay.
I just want to remind everybody. that what we're talking about, so we can finish this and can debate court packing forever. But I just want to remind everybody what we're talking about is an amendment that simply says that the Supreme Court should be subject to a code of ethics proposed by the Judicial Conference. And they are now not subject to any code of ethics, unlike every federal judge. So I think this makes sense that the Judicial Conference should, which is chaired by the Chief Justice, should make a code of conduct for the Supreme Court, and I therefore urge adoption of what should be an uncontroversial amendment, all our other digressions aside. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I yield back to her.
Thank you. I now yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from California.
I thank you for yielding, and I'm sorry we're taxing your voice today. And I think my colleague from New York, he's absolutely right. This amendment is about a code of ethics for the court. But I raise the size of the court and the packing of the court for an important reason. And that is because the American people need to know the court has been packed. They need to understand there is more than one way to pack a court. You can pack a court, as Roosevelt tried to do unsuccessfully, or you can pack a court the way McConnell did successfully. There are two justices. The plain fact is there are two justices on the court who shouldn't be there but for the partisan gamesmanship, the institution debilitating gamesmanship of Mitch McConnell that resulted in Merrick Garland not having a seat on the court and later resulted in Amy Coney Barrett having a seat on the court. Those two appointments wouldn't have happened if Mitch McConnell had allowed Barack Obama, had allowed his nominee to even get a hearing. Now you can say, well, but that's different because the size of the court remained the same. So he packed it without expanding it. Okay, fine. But the effect was exactly the same. And the addition of those two justices will mean, if unaddressed, that millions of Americans have lost their reproductive freedom. And that may be just the first right to disappear. That's the effect of that packing of the court. So whatever you want to call it stacking the court, or you want to call it packing in the court, the result is that an entire generation of Americans are going to see, for the first time in our history, their rights disappear. Their rights constricted, not enlarged.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
Did Harry Reid pack the lower courts when he dispensed with the tradition of how confirmations occurred and used the nuclear option to appoint judges to those courts? Did he pack them?
Well, he certainly added justices to the lower courts, but we're talking about a court.
By changing the rule.
Reclaiming my time, we're talking about a court. We're talking about 9 people, the least representative body in the country, that has enormous power over the lives of every single American, that operates without a code of ethics, that can decide to reject decades of precedent, that can decide that today you may have a right over your own body, but tomorrow you don't. Today you may have a right to marry the one you choose, but tomorrow you don't. Today you may have the right to marry someone of another race, and tomorrow you don't. And the effect, the unprecedented effect of with holding an appointment for one president and then in hypocritical fashion jamming another one down the throat of the American people means that an entire generation of Americans are losing their rights.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
Thank you. I agree with everything the gentleman has said, but I want to remind everybody that the amendment of the gentleman that we're voting on is to have a code of ethics for the Supreme Court and to do nothing more. I yield back.
The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Just real briefly, Mr. Chairman.
I appreciate the gentleman. Again, I am nervous, and I thought what the gentleman from North Carolina pointed out was right on target. This idea that the left gets to redefine terms is just it's hard to have a real debate when you can just change what things mean. The Senate confirming or not taking up a nominee that the president has submitted, that's not packing the court. That's just following the rules. Packing the court is when you change the rules and say, we're now going to add new justices to the court. That's what packing the court has historically always meant. So I think this is part, though, this committee has seen this over in the last Congress, and now it continues into this Congress where the left, the Democrats, our colleagues, continue to attack the court. They have threatened the court, so much so that it was the majority leader on the steps of the Supreme Court saying what he said about Justice Gorsuch and Kavanaugh And of course, we know what happened when the Democrats supported the intimidation that took place at the court when the leaked opinion, the Dobbs leaked opinion, draft opinion, was leaked out. So I hope we defeat this amendment. And with that,
Gentleman yield?
I yield back to the gentleman from California, and then he
Gentleman
can,
from California yield?
he can yield.
Would the gentleman from California yield?
Gentleman from California yields to the ranking member.
Thank you. Without getting into this debate about who packed the court and when and so forth and so on, I want to remind everybody that this is interesting, but it is not the amendment before us. The amendment before us says that the Judicial Conference of the United States, chaired by the Chief Justice, shall propose a code of conduct for the Supreme Court. They are the only court in the United States that doesn't have a code of conduct. They control the Judicial Conference, and all this amendment says is they should vote themselves a code of conduct. So I hope everybody can agree on that. I yield back.
The gentleman's point is well taken. It's
Yep.
just that I think history is so important that we shouldn't tend to rewrite it to suit our needs. I
But we
yield to the
should,
chairman.
but we should support this amendment.
Well, I think the amendment on its face has some separation of power concerns because it basically says something that Congress is going to pass can't actually become law until some other body takes some action, namely the Judicial Conference. That's probably a concern, a fundamental concern about separation of powers and the power we have as a separate and equal branch of government. So putting aside the packing the court argument that the sponsor of the amendment brought up, that we've had now for a while, and that the ranking member says we should move on from, there is just the problem with the amendment, what the plain language of the amendment says. I do think it's probably got a separation of power concern there when it says something Congress passed can't take effect until some other judicial body, the Judicial Conference, takes some action. That's probably a real concern and I think problematic for this, and another reason why we should oppose the amendment. With that, I yield back to the gentleman from California. Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield to the gentleman from California.
I thank the gentleman. You know, I just pose a question to the chairman. I appreciate you raising separation of powers concerns. I don't think they're implicated here. But I'm curious, Mr. Chairman, do you support a code of ethics for the Supreme Court?
I think the court has always maintained its ethical standards run through the Chief Justice. I think that's what should continue to happen.
And so is this because you have more confidence in 9 people with the power that they have? They don't need a code of ethics, but members of Congress do because they're operating on a higher moral plane or something? I don't understand. Why do we have a code of ethics, but the court doesn't need one? Can you explain that?
If the court wants to impose a code of ethics on themselves, like Congress has done to us, that's fine. But I leave that in the hands of the highest court in the land. I think that's consistent with the Constitution, as Ms. Hageman referenced earlier, and that resides with the Chief Justice of our
Would the
Supreme
gentleman
Court.
yield? Would the gentleman yield?
In just one moment, I have to yield, but you know, there are few bodies with the kind of really almost absolute power of the court within its domain. And really, Mr. Chairman, you think with all the power the Supreme Court has, we should leave it completely up to them whether they want to feel they have to abide by any code of ethics. Just going to leave it up to them. And if they want to become secretly beholden to very wealthy people with interests before the court, if they want to do that, well, then we're just content with that. We're content to leave it to them and just hope for the best. Is that where you're coming from, Mr. Chairman?
I gave you my answer.
Would the gentleman yield?
I'm happy to yield.
I just want to point out that, contrary to the chairman, we impose the code of ethics on ourselves. We impose the code of ethics on all federal judges other than the Supreme Court judges, and we can, by the same power, impose the code of ethics on the Supreme Court, though this amendment doesn't have us do it. It delegates that authority to the Judicial Conference. I yield back.
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. I mean, clearly, I struck a nerve here by pointing out the way in which the Senate Republican leader has packed the court, and I understand why that strikes a nerve. But let me tell you something. It may be offensive to Republicans on this committee to consider that court packing, but what is debilitating to the rest of the country is they've lost their reproductive freedom because of that packing. Because without it, millions of Americans would have control over their bodies that don't have it now. So you can say, well, we don't like the connotation that this was packing the court, because there's only one way to pack the court, and that is by expanding it. That's your view. But no, I think for millions of people that just lost their rights, they think there's clearly more than one way to pack the court, and you did it, and you did it. And the only question, I think, for the rest of us is whether we're prepared to do anything about it. Because the alternative is that for the next 30 years, we're going to have a reactionary court with a reactionary agenda, disregarding decades of precedent. That's the reality that millions of Americans are going to face if we do nothing about it. And if we can't even take the baby step here today of imposing a code of ethics, or at least not enlarging the court's power until there is a code of ethics, so we can't even take that step. And Mr. Nadler's exactly right. This step is even one step shy of imposing code of ethics, just saying, let's not expand the court's power until they have some ethical code. And that's even too much. But I guess when they're doing your political work, then no ethical code is necessary. I mean, we've seen that time and time again with the last administration, that as long as the last administration was furthering a reactionary agenda, no ethical code was necessary for the former president, and no ethical code is necessary for the current court. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The that's right.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
I'm going to strike the last word. I actually do not take, and agree that no.
Reserves a point of order.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 288 offered by Mr. Nadler of New York. Page 1, line 9, insert after extent necessary the following, quote, and except as otherwise provided in this section, unquote. Page 2, line 4, strike.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman from New York is recognized to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my amendment would exempt rules made by the Food and Drug Administration pertaining to consumer safety from the heightened judicial review requirements of this legislation. As we have noted, this bill would eliminate judicial deference, empowering activist courts to substitute their policy preferences for the specialized expertise of federal agencies. Ultimately, it would bring the agency rulemaking process to a halt, incentivizing judges to rewrite current regulations and introducing uncertainty into the effort to make new ones. In the more specific context of the FDA, it would hinder the agency's efforts to protect American consumers. Every year, 1 in every 6 people, roughly 48 million people, suffer from foodborne illness. Of these, more than 100,000 Americans are hospitalized and 3,000 people die. My amendment would preserve the ability of the FDA to react quickly to sudden crises in food or drug safety, saving lives and money in the process. It would preserve the ability of the agency to define dangerous levels of toxins and to protect our drinking water. And it recognizes the importance of the role that the FDA serves and the expertise they provide on a daily basis to protect the health and well-being of our constituents. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.